ciężki są Vade mecum of a young realist. The first step on the path of realism is to perceive that one has always been realistic. The second is to perceive that whatever one does to become otherwise, one will never succeed. The third is to ascertain that those who do pretend to think otherwise, think in realistic terms as soon as they forget to act their part. If one then wonders why, the conversion is almost complete. Most of those who say and believe that they are idealists would rather not be so, but they can see no alternative. One points out to them that they will never escape from their thought and that a beyond thought is unthinkable. If they decide to seek a response to this objection, they are lost in advance, because all the objections of the idealist to the realist are formulated in idealistic terms. Why should it be astonishing, then, that the idealist always brings back the victory? The idealist's solution of the problem is always implied by his questions. The realist must therefore be accustomed from the very beginning to refusing any discussion on a terrain which is not his own, and to judging himself in no difficulty because he cannot respond to some questions surely insoluble, which for him are not even posed. One must begin by being wary of the term thought itself, because the greatest of the differences between the realist and the idealist is that the idealist thinks while the realist knows. For the realist, to think is only to organize some previous acts of knowledge or to reflect on their content. He would never conceive of making thought the point of departure of his reflection, because a thought is possible for him only where there first exists some knowledge. Because the idealist goes from thought to things, he is unable to know if his starting point corresponds or not to an object. When he asks the realist how to rejoin the object in the departing from thought, the latter must hasten to answer that cannot be done, and that this indeed is the principal reason for not being an idealist. Realism, however, departs from knowledge, that is to say, from an act of the intellect, which consists essentially in sizing an object. Thus, for the realist, the question does not pose an insoluble problem, but a pseudo-problem, which is something entirely different. Each time that the idealist calls upon us to answer the questions which are posed by thought, we can be sure that he speaks in the name of the Spirit. For him, the Spirit is that which thinks. As for us, the intellect is that which knows. One must therefore avoid as much as possible compromising himself with this term. This is not always easy because it has legitimate meaning. However, we live in a time when necessity demands that we first retranslate into realistic language all the terms which idealism has borrowed from us and corrupted. An idealistic term is generally one used by the realist to designate the spiritual conditions of knowledge, but henceforward considered as engendering its own content. The knowledge of which the realist speaks is the living and experienced unity of an intellect and an apprehended reality. This is why a realistic philosophy bears always on the very thing which is apprehended and without which there would be no knowledge. Idealistic philosophies, on the contrary, since they stem from thought, very quickly succeed in choosing science or philosophy as the object of wit. When the idealist truly thinks in idealistic terms, he realizes under its perfect form the essence of the professor of philosophy, while when the realist truly thinks in realistic terms, he is in accordance with the authentic essence of the philosopher. It is the philosopher who speaks of things, but the professor of philosophy who speaks of philosophy. Just as we do not have to go from thought to things, knowing as we do that such an enterprise is impossible, so also we do not have to ask ourselves if a beyond thought is thinkable. It is possible that a beyond thought is unthinkable, but it is certain that all knowledge implies the beyond thought. The fact that this beyond thought is given to us by knowledge only in thought does not prevent its being a beyond. But the idealist always confuses being given in thought and being given by thought. For him who starts from knowledge, a beyond thought is conceivable that there is only this kind of thought which he can have a beyond. It is by a similar error that the realist wonders how one can, in starting with the ego, prove the existence of the non-ego. For the idealist who does start with the ego, this is the normal and even the only possible way of posing the question. The realist must be twice wary of it. First, because he does not start with the ego. Next, because for him the world is not a non-ego, which is nothing, but an in itself. A in itself can indeed be given in knowledge. A non-ego, to which reality is reduced by the idealist, can be neither sized by knowledge nor proved by thought, nor proven by thought. One should be more disturbed by the classical objection of the idealist against the possibility of attaining an in itself, and above all, of having a true knowledge of it. You define true knowledge, says the idealist, as an adequate copy of reality. But how can you know that the copy reproduces the thing such as it is in itself, since the thing is given to you only in thought? The objection is meaningful only for idealism, which posits thought before being, since it can no longer compare the two successfully. It wonders how another could do so. The realist, on the contrary, does not have to wonder whether things do or do not conform the knowledge which he has of them, since knowledge for him consists in being assimilated to things. In an order where the proportion of the intellect to the thing which the judgment formulates supposes the concrete and living correspondence of the intellect of its objects, it would be absurd to require of knowledge that it guarantee a conformity without which it cannot even exist. One must always remember that the impossibilities in which idealism wishes to corner realism are the work of idealism itself. When it defies us to compare the thing known with the thing itself, it only manifests the internal evil which eats away at it. For the realist, there is no noumenon in the sense in which the idealist understands it. The knowledge presupposes the presence of the thing itself to the intellect. There is no need to suppose behind the thing, which is in thought a duplicate, mysterious and unknowable, which would be the thing, and the thing in thought. To know is not to apprehend a thing as it is in thought, but in thought to apprehend a thing as it is. It is not sufficient to establish that everything is given to us in thought to conclude rightly that we should necessarily go from thought to things, and that it is impossible to proceed otherwise. As a matter of fact, we do proceed otherwise. The awakening of the intelligence coincides with the apprehension of things, which, as soon as they are perceived, are classified according to their most manifest analogies. From this fact, which has nothing to do with any theory itself must take rise. This is what realism does, following the similar example of common sense. This is why all realism is a philosophy of common sense. This does not mean that common sense is a philosophy. Rather, every healthy philosophy presupposes it and has confidence in it, even at the risk of appealing each time that it will be necessary to a common sense anywhere from badly informed to better informed. Such is the procedure of science, which is not a critique of common sense, but of its successive approximations of reality. The history of both science and philosophy testifies that common sense is capable of discovery thanks to the methodic use which it makes of its resources. One must therefore invite it to examine critically and ceaselessly the conclusions which it has obtained, which is not to invite it to renounce itself, but to remain itself. The word invention, like many other words, has been contaminated by idealism. To invent means to find, not to create. The inventor resembles the creator only in the practical order, especially in that of either utilitarian or artistic production. Every activity of intelligence therefore consists in its function of speculating on reality. If it does create, what it creates is never an object, but a way of explaining the object at the very interior of this object. This is also why the realist never demands that his knowledge engender an object without which it would not exist. Like the idealist, he makes use of his reflection, but the realist maintains it within the limits of the given reality. The starting point for his reflection must therefore be being, which is actually for us the beginning of knowledge, res sunt. If we penetrate the essence of the object itself, which is given to us, we orient ourselves towards a science which is crowned by a metaphysics of nature. If we penetrate the conditions in which the object is given to us, we orient ourselves towards a psychology which is crowned by a metaphysics of knowledge. The two methods are not only compatible, compatible, they are complementary, because they rest on the primitive unity of subject and object of an act of knowledge, and every complete philosophy implies the consciousness of this unity. Nothing prevents the realist, then, from proceeding by way of reflective analysis, from the object given in knowledge to the intellect and to the subject which knows. Indeed, on the contrary, he has no other method at his disposal to assure himself of the existence and nature of the knowing subject. Res sunt ergo cognosco, ergo sum res cognoscens. The realist is not distinguished from the idealist because the former rejects his analysis, while the latter accepts it. Later, the realist refuses to take the final term of his analysis for the principle engendering the analysis. Granted that the analysis of knowledge leads us to an I think, it does not follow that this cogito is the first principle of knowledge. Granted that every representation is, in fact, a thought, it does not follow either that there is only one thought, or even that the I think conditions all my presentations. All the strength of idealism comes from the coherence with which it develops the consequences of its initial error. One would therefore be very mistaken to reapproach it for its lack of logic. Quite the contrary, it is a doctrine which can live only by logic, since the order and connection of ideas here replaces the order and connection of things. The saltus mortalis, which precipitates a doctrine, is an anterior to the doctrine, and idealism can justify everything by its method, save idealism itself, and the reason is simply that the cause of idealism is not idealistic, it is not even epistemological, it is ethical. Prior to every philosophical explanation of knowledge comes the fact not only of knowledge itself, but also of the ardent desire of men to understand. If reason is too often content with summary and incomplete explanations, if it sometimes does violence to the facts, deforming them or passing over them when they are embarrassed, it is precisely because its passion for understanding prevails over its desire to know, or because the ways of knowing which are at its disposal are powerless to satisfy it. The realist is no less exposed to these temptations than idealist, and he yields to them no less often. The difference is that the realist surrenders to them against his principles, while the idealist posits in principle that such a surrender is legitimate. At the origin of realism, then, there is a resignation on the part of the intellect to depend on the reality, which is the cause of its knowledge. At the origin of idealism, there is the impatience of reason, which wishes to reduce reality to cognition, in order to be sure that its knowledge allows nothing to escape it. If a part of idealism has often tied itself to mathematics, it is precisely because that science, whose object is quantity, extends its jurisdiction over the whole of material nature, inasmuch as materiality depends on quantity. However, if idealism has sought its justification in the triumphs of mathematics, the latter owes nothing to idealism. the mathematical sciences are in no way bound to it, and they justify it all the less in so far as the most completely mathematized physics maintains all its constrictions at the very interior of the experimental facts which they interpret after vain efforts to render a new fact assimilable to the theory. Every mathematical physics will reform itself in order to fit the theory to the fact. The idealist is rarely a scientist, and still more rarely a man of the laboratory, yet it is the laboratory which furnishes the mathematical physics of tomorrow with the data it will have to explain. The realist therefore should have no fear that the idealist will confound him with scientific thought, because every scientist as such thinks in realistic terms, even if in philosophy he believes himself to be an idealist. A scientist will never begin by defying the method of the discipline he has going to establish. It is even by this characteristic that one can most surely recognize the false sciences. They are preceded by their methods. In truth, the method should be deduced from the science, not the science from the method. This is why no realist has ever written a discourse on method. He must know things themselves before he can understand how he knows them. He must apprehend each order itself of things before he can grasp the ways of knowing these orders. The most dangerous method of all is the reflective method. The realist is content with reflection. When the reflection becomes a method, it is no longer the intelligently directed act it should be, but a reflection which substitutes itself for reality. A reflection whose order becomes that of reality itself. When it is faithful to its essence, the reflective method supposes always that the final term of the reflection is also the first principle of our knowledge. It naturally follows from this that the last term of the analysis must contain virtually the totality of the analysis. Finally, whatever one cannot rediscover in starting from the ultimative term of the reflection either does not exist or can be legitimately treated as non-existent. Thus, one is led to exclude from knowledge and from reality itself the very thing without which knowledge would not exist. The second characteristic by which one can recognize the pseudosciences engendered by idealism is that, in taking their departure from what they all call thought, they commit themselves to defining truth as a particular case of error. Taine has rendered a great service to good sense by defining sensation as a true hallucination, because he has shown by this where logic necessarily leads idealism. Sensation then becomes the same thing as an hallucination. When this hallucination is really not a true one, one must not let himself be impressed, therefore, by the famous errors of the senses, nor be astonished by the fact that the idealists make much of them. They are people for whom the normal can be only a particular case of pathological. When Descartes is jubilant in establishing that even the insane cannot deny the first principle, I think, therefore I am. He aids us greatly in seeing what happens to reason when it is reduced to such a first principle. One must then consider as errors of the same order the arguments based on dreams, on the illusions of the senses, and on the madness, which the idealist has borrowed from the skeptics. He who is dreaming does not feel himself different from he who is awake, but he who is awake knows himself very different from he who is dreaming. He even knows that it is because he has previously had sensation that he can afterwards have what are designated as hallucinations, just as he knows that he would never dream anything if he were not previously awake. That some of the mentally ill deny the existence of the exterior world, or even, with all due respect to Descartes, their own existence, is no reason to consider the certitude of our existence as a particular case of the true delirium. These illusions are not disquieting to the idealist only because he doesn't know how to prove that they are illusions. They must not unnerve the realist, who alone knows that they are truly illusions. We should not take seriously the reproach addressed to us by certain idealists that our theory of knowledge condemns us to infallibility. We are simply philosophers for whom the true is normal and error abnormal. Nor does this mean that the true is not for us just as difficult to attain and converse as perfect hope. It is not because the realist cannot make a mistake that he differs from the idealist. The difference is first of all that when he does fail, it is not a thought unfaithful to itself which errs, but rather a knowledge unfaithful to its object. Above all, the realist is wrong only when he betrays his principles, while the idealist is right in the exact measure that he is unfaithful to his. To say that our knowledge is the seizure of the thing as it is does not at all mean that the intellect infallibly grasps the thing such as it is, but that it is only when it does so that there is knowledge. This signifies still less that knowledge exhausts in a single act the content of its object, that which knowledge grasps of the object is real, but reality is inexhaustible, and even when the intellect has discerned all its details, it still collides with the mystery of the object's very existence. It is the idealist Descartes who believes he can seize infallibly and at a single glance the whole of reality. The realist Pascal well knows how naive this pretension of the philosopher is, to comprehend the principles of things and from this, by a presumption of infinite as their object, to arrive at knowing all. The virtue proper to the realist is modesty in knowledge, and if this is not what he practices, it is what he is by profession bound to practice. The third characteristic by which one can recognize the pseudosciences which idealism generates is the need they feel to found their objects. In reality, they are not sure that their objects exist. For the realist, whose thought bears on being the good, the true, and the beautiful are fully real, since they are only being itself, desired, known, and admired. But from the moment when thought is substituted for knowledge, these transcendentals begin to fluctuate as in a vacuum, without knowing upon what to rest themselves. That is why idealism spends its time in founding morality, knowledge, and art, as if what men must do were not inscribed in the nature of man. The manner of knowing in the very structure of our intellect, and art in the practical activity of the artist himself. The realist never has anything to found, but he has to discover constantly the foundations of his operations, and it is in the nature of things that he finds them. Operatio sequitur esse. Thus, one must be also cautious to turn himself away from any speculation on values. Values are nothing other than transcendentals which have separated themselves from being and try to substitute themselves for it. The founding of values thus becomes an obsession of the idealist, but for the realist, nothing. It is extremely difficult for a man of our times to refuse to become a critical spirit. Nevertheless, to such a denial must the realist be resigned, for the critical spirit is the end point of idealism, and there one finds it again, no longer as a principle or a doctrine, but as the will to serve a cause. The critical spirit actually expresses the resolution to submit the facts to a suitable treatment, in order that nothing in them any longer offer resistance to the spirit. The procedure to follow in order to be successful is to substitute everywhere the point of view of the observer for that of the observed. This negation of reality will be pursued, if necessary, to its most extreme consequences. Indeed, the more alive and the resistance opposing this process will be, the more will the idealist be determined to ignore it. The realist, on the contrary, must always recognize the object as the cause of knowledge and treat it with the deepest respect. To respect the object of knowledge is, before all else, to refuse to reduce it to what it would have to be in order to be substitute to the rules of a type of knowledge arbitrarily chosen by us. There is no reason to condemn introspection because it does not permit us to reduce psychology to the status of an exact science. It may be that its object is such that psychology should not become an exact science, at least if it wishes to remain faithful to its object. Human psychology, such as a dog knows it, must be at least as sure as our science of nature, and our science of nature is nearly as penetrating as human psychology, as a dog knows it. Behavioral psychology is thus perfectly wise in adopting the dog's point of view towards man, for as soon as consciousness enters upon the scene, it reveals us so many things that the infinite divergence between our science of consciousness and consciousness itself bursts upon the eyes. If our organism were conscious of itself, who knows if biology biology and physics would still be possible to us. The realist should always maintain, then, against the idealist, that to every order of reality there must correspond a certain manner of approaching and explaining this reality. Having then refused to deliver himself to a critic prior to knowledge, he will find himself free, and much freer than the idealist, to deliver himself to a critic of knowledges, in measuring them by their objects. The critical spirit criticizes all, save itself. The realist becomes, he is not a critical spirit, never accuses to criticize himself. He will never believe that the psychology which places itself outside of consciousness at the outset, in order to know it better, gives him an equivalent of consciousness. Nor will he believe with Durkheim that the true savages are in books, or that the social reduces itself to a constraint accompanied by sanctions. As if the only society we have to explain were that of Leviticus. He will no more believe that historical criticism is in a better position than the witness invoked by it in order to know what has happened to them and to discern the exact meaning of what they themselves have said. This is why realism, in subjecting knowledge to its objects, places the intelligence in the most favorable conditions of discovery. Indeed, even if it is true that things have not always occurred as their witnesses have believed, the relative errors which they might have committed are of little matter next to those in which our fancy will involve us, if we reconstruct according to our own estimation facts, feelings, and ideas which we have not experienced. Such is the freedom of realists, for we have a choice: either we defer to the facts and are free from our thought, or we are free from the facts and enslaved by our thought. Therefore, let us turn ourselves toward the things themselves which knowledge apprehends, and towards the relation of our cognitions to the things which they apprehend. In regulating itself better and better by these things, philosophy can progress anew. It is also in this spirit that it is suitable to read the great philosophers who have entered before us on the way of realism. It is not in Montaigne, writes Pascal, it is in me that I find all that I see there. Likewise, it is not in St. Thomas or in Aristotle, but in things that the true realist sees, that all that he sees in them. He will therefore not hesitate to quote those masters as his authority, because for him they are only guides towards reality itself, and if the idealist reproaches him as one of these has just amiably done, with clothing himself richly with the hand-meadows of truth, his response will be quite ready. It is still better to be clothed richly in the hand-me-downs of truth from others, as the realist feels in need of doing, than to refuse to do so and, like the idealist, go naked.